Hello and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm your host, Lisa Pugh. She's coming up on her 1-year anniversary in office, and DPI State School Superintendent Dr. Jill Underly has been at the helm during perhaps one of the most challenging years for Wisconsin public schools. She has overseen the disbursement of millions in federal COVID relief dollars, and she's faced criticism for classroom restrictions, lagging test scores, yet she's remained steadfast in her demand for more support and funding for public schools. She joins us today. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Underly.
Happy to be here, Lisa. Thank you.
So it's been quite a year. Prior to this job, you'd been a teacher, a school administrator. Now you're in this more political role. What have there been any surprises? What's the last year been like for you?
Well, my anniversary for the election will be in April, but I took office in July. So it's only been 7 months, 8 months in. It's really, the leadership aspect isn't new. I've worked with school boards before. I've been on statewide committees. And really, it's just been an honor and a privilege, honestly, to be able to represent public schools throughout the state. So I'm really excited about the ability to, like you said, work with federal dollars and state dollars and try to do things and strategies that'll help public school kids in Wisconsin.
Education has always been political. It seems even more so now with some of the things we're seeing nationally in elections and school boards, and certainly in Wisconsin. I know you've been dealing with the legislature. Lots of education-related bills coming almost rapid fire from our Republican-controlled legislature. Everything from legislation directing reading curriculum and test scores, expansion of the school voucher program, Parental Bill of Rights, Milwaukee Public Schools overhaul, and more. I know DPI has generally been opposed to a lot of these proposals. Do you dismiss them as pure politics, or are there things that do need to change? Are there any good ideas coming out of the legislature?
Sure. Well, certainly things do need to change, and I would never dismiss anything that came out of another governmental body, especially at the state. But I honestly do feel that this is political. I mean, what we have is public schools, which should not be political, right? That's why they're nonpartisan school board elections and nonpartisan for my office, for example. It shouldn't matter what your political affiliation is. Everybody loves their local public school, whether you're in the Northwoods or you're in Southwest Wisconsin like myself. But on the other hand, we are in an election year, and we have a governor who's up for re-election who is passionate also about public schools, and that's his career. It's expected, right? He loves kids, he loves communities, he loves Wisconsin, and public schools encompass all of that. And so we do have a legislature that's and individuals in control who don't want to see him get any kinds of wins. And so if he's, campaigning on public education or supporting public education, they're not going to give him that win. That's my impression of it. Certainly when it comes to educational policy, a lot of these bills, though, don't make sense. The way that I reflect on it is that the DPI hasn't been consulted in these bills. We're the education experts, public education experts, and when you have these bills that are rather narrow, they almost micromanage really the local school districts, and in a local control state, to take issue with that. So we have come out against these bills because we don't feel that they're helpful for the vast majority of our school districts.
So their ideas aren't the right ideas?
Right. So their ideas, I think, are aimed to be political. They're aimed to get vetoes. They're aimed to get no support from us because of the fact that they're not helpful to aid in the messaging, right, that they are trying to advance. What we do need are bills that help our schools. We need bills that help with expanding things that work, like early childhood education. We need bills around school funding. We haven't gotten an increase in a time when we have incredible inflation. Our school districts are trying to meet budget for next year, and we're trying to make ends meet. We get reimbursed very little for special education costs. There's no bills about those kinds of things. There's no bills about how to attract and retain more teachers in our classroom. There's no bills about mental health
So those are the ideas
Those
you'd
are
like
the things
to see.
we need.
So are you reaching out to Republicans saying, let's work on these ideas?
Yes, we have. And that's there was the Blue Ribbon Commission on Public Education Funding, which I testified for. This was back in 2018. The final report came out in January of 2019. It was bipartisan. It was a list of all the things that we can do, and we had bipartisan support. There are no bills advancing those items, which for me then confirms that this is all political theater.
So it sounds like that's your goal for next year, and the rest of your term is to keep looking toward agreement on those ideas.
Yes. I'm the chief advocate for public schools, and so what I'm going to do is advocate for our public schools.
Mm-hmm. You know, it is hard not to argue that our state test scores could be better. So I want to show you a slide, some data that was released by DPI last fall. This graph displays the percentage of students who tested as proficient and not proficient in English language arts on the Forward and Dynamic Learning MAPS exams in 2020-2021. This includes students grades 3 through 8. It shows 33.7%, or a third are proficient, 53% not proficient, also showing students who didn't complete or who opted out of testing. And if we look at the math scores for that same group of students, again, 3rd through 8th graders, we see exactly pretty much the same results, only a third of tested students reaching proficiency on that exam. So when you look at those scores, what do you see?
We certainly could do better. That's what I see. However, I think we need to take them with a grain of salt. This was done last year, and last year's conditions were anything but consistent with the year prior, the years prior to that. We didn't have a test in the spring of 2020, and so we're comparing post or during pandemic times to pre-pandemic times, and it was certainly extraordinary. Last year we had so many families opt not to have their kids test for safety reasons or other reasons. And DPI has always used strong caution when trying to interpret these results when you don't have an apples-to-apples comparison. But that being said, we do need to do better. You mentioned the MAP scores, for example. Those are more formative, and they certainly do predict, forward exam results. But when you look at national results, like with the NAEP, for example, Wisconsin's at or above, the national averages and things, but we could still do better. Obviously, we're not as high as where we used to be, but I think when we look at a decline in test scores, we also have to take into consideration we've had a decline in a lot of other things too. We've had a decline in support from our state legislature in funding our public schools. We've had a decline in the number of individuals who are going into teaching. And we've had a decline in support and mental health aids and all these things that we know work to help our kids do well in school. Our school districts, with the decline in funding, they haven't been keeping up facilities. They've had to go to local referendums. And when you look at learning conditions and building conditions, you want to make sure that, they're conducive to 21st century learning. And we're not doing any of that. So I have to say, take it with a grain of salt. It's way more complicated. Certainly last year shouldn't reflect on years prior, because last year was extraordinary. We do have work to do, but I also say, though, that our legislature has a lot of work to do. If they want better results, they need to be supporting our public schools better too.
I hear what you're saying about the pandemic and lower test participation really kind of impacting and important to consider when looking at these results. However, I think I've also heard your critics say that, other states have those same conditions, and that Wisconsin scores were trending down prior to the pandemic, and that we aren't doing as well compared to peer states. Is that a fair thing to say?
I would say it's accurate that we're not doing as well compared to peer states, but I'd also look at the funding that those peer states are giving their public schools. In 2011, we cut $600 per student from our school budgets. And so we've had a downward trend, not just in test scores, but we've had a downward trend in support for our public schools for at least 10 years.
And no other state has a similar change like that.
After the recession in 2009 to 2011, after the recession, and we had a lot of freeze on spending in public education, and other states did too. Other states restarted their spending, not just in K-12, but in higher ed, where Wisconsin did not. We are still at pre-pandemic funding level, pre-recession funding levels here in Wisconsin. And we need to bring that back up. When you look at other states, they're paying their teachers more. In other states, they're investing in their infrastructure. And in Wisconsin, we're not doing that.
So I know I've heard Republicans in the legislature say, with all of the federal infusion of money for education, there's unprecedented, whether it's coming from state GPR or federal, there's unprecedented money in our public schools. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think on the surface, yeah, there is unprecedented money when you look at the federal dollars, but those are one-time dollars. So I always look at this as like a house analogy. A lot of people watching probably own their own homes. And if they get a tax return or they get a bonus at work, are they going to budget that going forward and how they're going to spend their dollars? Are they going to budget that towards their utilities or towards their grocery bill, for 10 years out? No, they're going to use it for something like to fix the roof or maybe pay off a debt. They're not going to put that as part of their base building. And our schools are getting this money from the federal government to respond to the pandemic. There were so many additional costs associated with the pandemic, not just with PPE, but also infrastructure. We had some school districts putting in air filters, for example, in their classrooms. We had additional transportation costs. We had additional personnel costs. And these are just one-time fixes. These are not meant to go into perpetuity. So it is a criticism, and I take it like really they're just out of touch with the fact of what really goes on in our public schools. These dollars were not meant to sustain us like our state budget is meant to.
So it's not fair to say that those federal dollars should be focused on let's get every third grade student's reading scores up this year.
Right. I mean, we can certainly use it towards things like, teacher pay or maybe an additional reading coach or instructional coach. But what are you going to do with it after the federal dollars? Once those federal dollars are gone, we're going to have to let those people go. And so if the state legislature was really serious about wanting to improve, the climate and the conditions and mental health funding and, teacher recruitment and retention or getting our reading scores up or music programs or art programs, if they were really serious about that, they would invest. Budgets are value statements, and we're not seeing that from this legislature.
Another issue that I know is near and dear to you and that I see imprinted in the federal COVID relief plan that was sent to the Department of Education, how are we going to spend is the achievement gap, the opportunity gap. And we have some serious issues there when you look at different groups of students. I want to share some data directly from your plan, Wisconsin's plan for federal COVID relief funding. Gaps for low-income students as compared to peers who are not low income, a 29% gap in language arts scores, 31% gap in math scores. Gaps for black students. I know that Wisconsin has historically had the widest achievement gap in the nation for black students. There's a 37% point gap in language arts scores, 40-point gap for math scores. Those look pretty grim. How are we going to change that? What is the plan?
Yeah, those scores and the gaps are unacceptable. And it's embarrassing, honestly, that we're in this position that we're in. But I think when we look at it, we have to look behind the curtain some more. Yeah, you mentioned, Lisa, that school districts that have higher achievement are also lower poverty. And that's the inverse of saying certainly kids that are in high poverty are going to have have low achievement. So high poverty, low achievement. And when you look at the opportunity gaps, for sure, better school districts are better resourced. They're able to reach their kids because they have more personnel, they have specialists, they have great learning facilities and teaching facilities. Communities that have more resources are simply going to have better schools. And there's certainly outliers, don't get me wrong, but when we look at Wisconsin and we look at the opportunity gaps, we have segregation in the state that has been going on for decades. And if we really want to address student learning in our highest poverty communities, we have to get those schools more resources. That's just really what it comes down to. The kids that are in low resourced schools that don't have access to the enrichment programs, the after school programs, the full day 4K or the mental health or the food security, how can we expect them to succeed or excel at the same rates as kids in other communities who have all those things? So we can certainly blame public education for a lot of these things, which a lot of people want to do. But public education didn't cause the severe poverty or the segregation that we see in this state. And so we need to fix that.
Sounds like really it's more than, you're thinking it's more than just schools and maybe even more than funding. It's a community-oriented solution.
Well, it should be a goal of our state legislature to make sure that all kids have the same opportunities to be successful and to excel. Their long-term educational impacts and outcomes are going to impact us throughout the rest of our lives. Our kids are the future of the state, and if they're unable to succeed, what does that say for our future doctors, our engineers, our teachers, our government officials, if they don't have the conditions to be able to overcome these gaps and to be successful? We're really setting our state up for a future failure.
You know, it's Black History Month, and we just talked about that achievement gap for Wisconsin students who are Black. Many states and communities grappling with something called critical race theory. There was a bill to ban the teaching of critical race theory in Wisconsin schools that the governor recently vetoed. This is a hard issue, and people feel pretty strongly about this. How should schools be talking about race?
So I was a social studies teacher. I taught government, and I taught U.S. history, and I taught current events. And you can't talk about those things without talking about the hard issues. I mean, that's what's expected. And what certain people who are partisan want to call CRT in our schools is not CRT. That is not being taught in our schools. We're teaching the real history. We're teaching the real government, the policy solutions, and we have to talk about the past. And if we're going to do so effectively, we can't, if we're going to do so effectively, we have to talk about these hard topics. So I want my students to grow up and be active participants in this democracy. And again, it just means that we have to talk about the hard topics. And, you know, I think CRT, just to go back to the whole partisan aspect of this, there's certainly bills that are being advanced in this legislature, as there are in the old nation, just to really get people worked up about something that doesn't exist.
So are there things we are missing in the way that we're talking about race in our schools now that need to change? Or are you just making the point that CRT isn't really what's happening?
I'm making the point that CRT is not really what's happening. I think it's meant to be a red herring to get people worked up about something, to unify, you know, certain aspects of perhaps a political base. You know, public schools are not strangers to controversy, but I don't feel that, you know, putting in a culture war in our school districts right now while we're trying to come through a pandemic is really the right thing to be doing to our communities and our kids.
Mm-hmm. Other than race, certainly pandemic-related policies have also been very controversial, and we've seen school boards in Wisconsin have great debates around masking policies. I know there's a bill now, another bill being advanced that would allow parents to opt their children out of mask mandates and other sorts of policies. These cause such great division in our communities. How do you suggest that communities grapple with these issues and kind of come together?
I think that you just nailed it. It's intended to cause division in our communities. Really, it's meant to, it's intended to be political by the people who are creating these bills. Public health shouldn't be political. If, you know, when I was a school superintendent, if we had an outbreak of the flu, the health department would come in and say, you know what, you need to shut down for a couple days and do a deep clean and let things settle. I didn't question it. It wasn't like we had parents coming to our school board meeting saying, you know, we don't believe the health department in what they're recommending. When we come to the pandemic or when we come to other things like masking, and we really need to follow good science. We need to follow the recommendations of the scientists and the healthcare officials that are making these decisions. And as a school district administrator, we need to do what we need to do to make sure that our kids are safe. masking is a local issue. And if a school board and the administrator of that district say we're going to mask, the state legislature doesn't need to get involved in these local issues.
That particular issue and others that we're seeing really talk about that role of the parent in their students' experience in schools, and that parent bill of rights that we talked about. Like, what should be a parent's role in the schools, and how do you balance that parent's right to voice and have control over what they think is right for their student, and then what policies say should be happening in schools?
Sure. So our school districts all welcome authentic parental engagement in our schools. When we look at high achieving schools, they have high parental involvement. But the parental involvement, like in the Parents' Bill of Rights that is being advanced in the legislature, that's not authentic. That's meant to pit parents against teachers or parents against administrators or school boards. That's not authentic parental engagement. Authentic parental engagement is, opportunities to engage, in our schools through lessons or maybe field trips, or, having parents come in and work with their child on a project, or read with their child, or implement strategies from school to home that help their child be successful. That's authentic. It's a partnership between our parents and our teachers. It's, when kids come home and they work on school and the parents are excited to hear about their day, it's just as important for the teacher to reach out to the parent and to say, hey, tell me more about your child. Or if the child is struggling, tell me a little bit more about how I can help. Those are the kinds of things that we cherish in our relationships with home and school. The Parental Bill of Rights, like I said, it's meant to aggravate that relationship and pit parents against the school, and that's not okay. And it's really unfortunate that our legislature, again, is trying to do this to our families when we're already very stressed out about the pandemic.
There's another piece that I know the legislature has talked about is the release of school accountability reports by the department, and questioning that some of those accountability reports looked more favorable for certain schools even as test scores were declining. What is the explanation for that?
Yeah, I think, it's no matter how our schools turn out, sometimes I feel that there's individuals in the legislature who are going to think that our schools are failing when they shouldn't be. And so that being said, it looks at skip year growth, which is difficult when you've skipped a year already in a pandemic. So it's really, like I said, it's just complicated to explain. But when it comes down to our school report cards, they're a snapshot. They're just one picture in time as to how our kids are doing. And as I said earlier in the interview, this past time that we took the statewide accountability tests, we didn't have as many kids participating, so that was an issue. And the conditions were not the same. And again, we also had a year of skip in there already. We didn't take the test in 2020. So, and then just to, my own commentary, like I said, no matter how our schools came out of this, I feel that, there are people in the legislature who want our public schools to fail, so that no matter how well we came out on paper, they were still going to question it.
You mentioned this a little earlier in the interview, that with the infusion of the one-time COVID dollars and the component of inflation, a lot of school districts predicting a fiscal cliff that can be quite serious in coming years. At a recent school board meeting in my own school district, they shared a budget forecast model predicting a $2.3 million deficit for the upcoming 2022-23 school year. Is this a statewide crisis?
Yeah, it's the reality that our school districts are facing.
So a lot of districts are saying the same thing.
Absolutely. Every school district is saying this. We did not get any increase this past budget. So this past budget, 21 to 23, from our state legislature. No increase. We have 5% inflation almost. I think it's 4.7%. So our school districts are grappling with increased transportation costs, utilities, pay for our staff, and all these other aspects. What if your roof has a leak. I mean, there's really no room for any kind of wiggle room because we haven't gotten any increase from the state just to keep up with expenses. So that is an accurate picture that every school district is going to be facing. We don't have money for it. You mentioned prior the one-time federal funds. Those run out in 2023. So what are we going to be able to do with the next budget? We're going to have to really demand more from our legislature if they expect us to be able to operate our public schools.
You also mentioned this concern regarding the teacher shortage. January poll nationally of educators, 55% of teachers say they will leave teaching sooner than they had originally planned. 90% of the participants said they're feeling burnout is a major problem. Then in Wisconsin universities showing far fewer people getting teaching degrees. What do you attribute that to?
It's demoralization, really, is what I attribute it to. I mean, certainly the burnout aspect is real. When you look at the beginning of the pandemic, the way that our educators stepped up, and it was our teachers, it was food service, it was bus drivers, they were all, getting materials to kids, they were getting food to families, they were being lauded, as local heroes for everything that they were doing. And then here we are a year and a half later, and the narrative is completely turned against our educators. But this is part of a trend, that has been happening since 2011. When you look at the number of people who started going into teaching to replace the baby boomers who are retiring, we've had fewer people, to be able to replace them. And so I'll just tell you quickly, when I was looking for a teaching job in Wisconsin in 2005, I was told that I was one of 250 applicants when I inquired as to why I hadn't heard back yet. Oh, you're one of 250 applicants. And then on the other hand, when I'm at the other side of the desk as a district administrator in 2018, the same position I would have applied for, we were lucky to get 6 applicants, and then 3 of which accepted another job by the time we even got around to interviewing them. So it's a part of a wider trend, but when you look at the compounding aspect of the pandemic, and then all these bills from the legislature that are trying to micromanage how our schools are run, it should be no surprise. And then when we think about how we want our schools to function, we want great teachers in our schools, and that takes time. You have to get the experience, you have to be mentored by other teachers who have been in the system for longer in order to be able to be those experts, but we're not able to see that. So it's alarming. And I think every parent, every community member should be shocked, but they also should be outraged that our state legislature is allowing this to continue.
So once we get some warmer weather here in Wisconsin, we'll be thinking about graduation time. What would you say to a graduating high schooler about getting into the teaching profession now in Wisconsin?
Well, I'm biased, but it's the greatest profession that there certainly is. I'm hopeful, of course, that we'll be able to right the ship. It's not too late. Certainly, we can turn things around, but we do need to start paying attention to the working conditions. We do need to pay attention to how we pay people, but we also need to be paying attention to how we treat people. And what we're seeing is, what we hear is, treat everybody kindly. The whole world is short-staffed, for example, and be patient. But all of these other aspects, it's really easy to say, but then when we see it in action, it's harder to do. And we need to make sure that we are understanding. And so if, individuals are thinking about going into teaching, encourage them to do so, because it is the greatest profession. You get to shape lives. You get to work with kids. And I'll be honest, if you're having a bad day, just go down to the kindergarten classroom and spend a few minutes there, because those kids are so full of life, they're so kind, they're funny. And I taught high school, and I love high school kids for those same reasons. They're goofy, but they're going to change the world. And I'm optimistic that we will get there together, but we have to right the ship now.
In your state education convention remarks earlier this year, you indicated a hopefulness for collaboration and wanting to work with, we've spent a lot of time talking about the legislature today and how DPI and your colleagues maybe aren't on the same page with some members of the legislature. Where is that common ground? What do you see in maybe the next year, the next budget where you can work together?
Yeah, I'm still hopeful. As I said, I know a lot of this has to do with the fact that it's an election year, and so they're going to attack the person who's running for re-election on issues that are important to him. But that being said, I think once we get through the election, I think they'll be paying attention again. We do need to look back at that bipartisan Blue Ribbon Commission on School Funding again and implement some of those strategies, because that'll help with our school deficits. That'll help with funding special education, for example. But it will also, I think we can have some honest conversations about what we prioritize in this state and what we want for our kids and what we want for the future of this state. But we can't get there without without an investment in public education. We all want the same things. I truly believe that. And I feel that that's where we have, certainly room for agreement, but also room for compromise too.
So you're hopeful for collaboration. You sound like you're hopeful for future teachers in Wisconsin. Anything else that kind of gets you excited when you look at the coming year?
I'm excited. I really am. I think there's so many good things that are really going on in our school districts. And I get a chance to go and visit schools. This is CTE month, which is Career and Tech Ed month. So I've seen some amazing things in our school districts. Chippewa Falls, for example. I was in Wauwatosa a couple of weeks ago. I'll be in Bigfoot later this week. But it's really, there are some wonderful things going on if we can cut through the distractions and really pay attention. I think people are impressed, but our people in the state know we have good public schools. And we saw that, when I got elected in April of 2021, is that I ran as this public school advocate. And no matter where you are in the state of Wisconsin, you love your public school. You can be in the Northwoods, like I said, Southwest, where I'm from, but people love their public school. And that, to me, is hopeful for the future, too.
Is that what keeps you going when you have these debates?
100%. Like I said, we all want the same things, right? We all want great teachers. We all want great schools. We all want what's best for kids. And we just have to get through the political theater to find that out.
Well, I want to thank you so much for a really candid conversation today. Thank you, Dr. Underly, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you to the viewers of Newsmakers. Be sure to tune in again as we highlight the issues and sit down with the decision makers who make a difference for all of us.
This program is a production of Wisconsin Eye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. Wisconsin Eye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civics broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol.